the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Neglected Aspects of Sufi Study by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. But what is the unexpected? This brings us to a further important consideration of the Sufi attitude towards perceptions, which does cut across quite a lot of customary Western reactions. We are all aware that children like jokes, and that they mostly go through a phase when they love the most banal and absurd jokes, and even like to repeat them again and again, almost at times to the verge of hysteria. Then comes the period of cultivation of the sense of humour, when the mature, so-called, individual responds only to new, unexpected or subtle jokes. Western observers have often remarked at the childishness of many Eastern peoples, who like to hear puns, like to have old jokes repeated, take pleasure in small incongruities. Punning is the lowest form of humour by Western standards. Few people, if anyone at all, seem to have bothered to wonder whether the wearing out of the impact capacity of a joke is ennui or maturity, whether it is an advance or a form of insensitivity. The Sufi usage of discontinuities, though you may have to take my word for it here, makes it possible for people to derive as much enjoyment from something which they have seen or heard before as from something completely new to them. In some active circles, it is even a test of ability to understand some advanced concepts, to see whether someone is too sophisticated to react to a gentle impulse rather than an ever different, ever harsher one. People who cannot do this, as well, let it be said, as having sophistication, may have to undergo a certain kind of sensitivity training before they can reacquire this childish capacity. The nearest comparison I can readily find in the West is the fleeting states when people think things are funny or interesting in altered states of awareness, brought about as byproducts of drugs, hypnosis, overexertion, and so on. In the East, there are many examples on record of people repeating poetry or various texts, often very well-known ones, including ritual repetitions, and suddenly realizing what they mean in a sort of inspiration, as though the impulse came from outside. Ibn Arabi, the great Andalusian teacher, it will have been noticed, speaks of this in what are almost recognizably modern terms, when he says that knowledge is not gained, it is there all the time. It is the veils which have to be dissolved in the mind. He also speaks of God as the name given by man to the impulse which originates all kinds of developments, rendered in customary terms as the deity which most people associate with that word, but nonetheless important by reason of his referring to it in what we would today call scientific terms, and this in the 13th century. The contemporary situation regarding Sufi ideas is worth examining, I think, because we have on this planet, and even within one and the same community, as often as not, very divergent views on whether what has in the past been called mysticism and religion is to be seen in a psychological, scientific, or votive light. The battle continues, with the West today still fighting about many points which were, interestingly enough, stated and answered in a most illuminating manner centuries ago in the East. While the present inebriation caused by the descent of every kind of mind upon the Sufi heritage is still raging, and as books strongly tinged, to say the least, with special pleading pour from the presses, there is still much that we can find in the traditional literature to illustrate the equal validity of all three approaches. The special pleaders, as is always the case, will catch up with us in their own good time. Meanwhile, they must think as they think, probably because to do so supports their need for reductionist symmetry, even at the cost of truth. After all, If to them symmetry gained through oversimplification is truth, there is nothing that we can do until they have ceased to need such crutches. But they and others imagine them to be spiritual people. The first requirement for those who wish to know more, no matter the cost to their cherished beliefs, is, in the West as in the East, to define where things have gone wrong. The basic error seems undoubtedly to be that while Sufis and others take a working hypothesis to help them guide a student to a certain point, others seize upon what they say and do as being perennially applicable, and mistake such statements for laws or rules. If, for instance, I say, "It is not too far to New Jersey," this is a relative statement, produced for a purpose. It cannot be true at all times, in all company, everywhere in the world. Luckily for us today, many Sufis have in the past made a point of asserting this relativity, and therein lies the secret of flexible thought, even the potentiality of progress, since if you believe that something is true, you will not try to think, be, or do something which seems to conflict with that absolute. This may seem elementary. Just apply it to the observation of the lives of people around you, including your own, and to the books which you read, and you will soon see how to transcend limitations. I do not here mean that you will necessarily, without other coaching, be able to transcend limitations at will, but a theoretical grasp of this will be better than none at all. The rightly mocked phrase, "If God had intended us to fly, he would have given us wings," is still very much with us in reality, though it now hides behind unexamined assumptions. 1,000 years and more ago, it was being written in the East that Sufism was formerly a reality without a name. Now it is a name without a reality. In the present day, there are plenty of cults and plenty of approaches to Sufism. Some of us are interested in the reality still, and are not greatly disturbed by the names. This is something of an advance, because it enables us to register that such and such a cult or group, whatever its name, is playing out a role which its members need. If it calls itself Sufi, we do not need to find much harm in that, since the advantage to the members is that they are happy, or happy in their misery, feel fulfilled, or feel significance in their struggle for fulfillment. The information side of what real Sufis are doing is, of course, important, but constitutes only a fraction compared to the total activity. All Sufi endeavors have this iceberg-like reality, and we do take the rendering of Sufic ideas on comprehensible lines, for East and West, seriously. Here is one example. I was recently approached by people from the BBC in London to take part in a broadcast about the effect of Eastern and other anti-intellectual cults, such as astrology, in and on the West. A distinguished Western thinker was saying that the invasion of soothsayers and the such like was undermining Western culture and would lead to its serious, if not complete, deterioration. The mentality which was being so deplored was characterized as magical, in the widest sense, thinking. When the approach was first made, I was away in the Middle East, and my assistant, feeling that this orientation was highly speculative and, however alarming, hardly in line with Western thought itself, let alone my approach towards it, sent some reprint material to the producer who had written, and suggested that the subject should be approached with caution, if at all. His belief, although he said that we might have a meeting to discuss it, was that a sight of the enclosed literature, which clearly indicated our stand on the subject, would allow the matter to be decently buried. But things so fell out that I found myself, soon afterwards, talking to a highly articulate and well-educated BBC representative. I explained that first, I did not know of any evidence on which the contention of the magicians and so on doing harm could be based, and second, whoever had said it should surely produce such evidence, not just be able to magnetize interest by shouting it out, so to speak. I also pointed out that someone who objected to wholesale imports of Eastern and magical cults should, presumably, be accompanied or opposed on the program not by me, but by someone, say a guru, who thought that they should be so imported. I continued that the only other individual that I could visualize as taking part in such a discussion would be someone who might take the middle way and say, as a scientist, for example, that there might be bits and pieces which could be adopted from Eastern or magical lore to the advantage of the West. I am happy to report that I was able to convey this picture, which included my own incompetence and irrelevancy, in such a program. But what surprised me was that there was relatively little interest in, let alone knowledge of, the fact that the alleged situation, cults, anti-cult, and taking bits from cults, might very likely not be the true one at all. Furthermore, the assurance that all over the Western world there were perhaps millions of people interested in the study of Eastern ideas in a different way from the three alternatives offered seemed to raise little enthusiasm. In the East we are used to cults, and in general take little notice of them. The people who appeal to easily conditioned or hysterical followers in the West exist in the East too, but their clientele is confined for the most part to certain types in any community, whatever their culture. We have learnt to live with these gurus, like you in the West live with hysterical advertising or various fashion crazes. People on the whole do not take them seriously. But this statement alone, when made in the West, is still often met with amazement or embarrassment. Further, our own efforts to render so-called Eastern ideas in terms of Western culture and preoccupations, at least in part, likewise encounter great surprise. And yet there is no doubt in my own mind, and in that of many other people working in this field, that it is this last method of approach and study which is having the greatest real effect, and which will have the most permanent importance. The confusion is undoubtedly due to the fact that too many people in the West still regard things which are most colourful or make the most noise as the most significant for their time, their culture, their future. Experience to the contrary does not always teach such people a lesson. Because in the East we have been exposed to tolerated and widely varying numbers of spiritual teachers for many centuries, the whole institution has been able to settle down. People have even developed a feel for the real functions being exercised by a supposedly spiritual body or teacher, and have been inoculated against the worst likely excesses of charlatans. As the West continues to develop and attract material from centers of study and all kinds of individuals involved in esoteric matters, far beyond the former confines of the cranks, we may expect a similar development here. Pass from names and look at qualities, says Rumi, so that the qualities may show the way to the essence. The difference of people came about from names. When the inner meaning, ma'ana, is reached, peace descends. The names, the external formulations, including labels, are there to enable one to pass from them into reality, into the essence. As soon as the names, the different external forms, become a matter of comparison, dissension descends. This is why Ibn Arabi says that the teacher must maintain to his students that his path is the only way. Since, for example, you and I are not comparative topographers, but people who, say, want to get from A to B, miscellaneous studies in the various routes, and even in whether they are routes at all, cannot take place. What has to happen is that someone maintains that he knows the way and the others accept this. This leads to a teaching situation. Rumi puts it even more clearly when he says, "Traditional knowledge is like using sand to clean yourself when water is available. Become ignorant and be trusting to be released from your ignorance." Sufi study is not a matter of establishing a permanent and unchanging format for following it, but a matter of the existence of people who will be able to maintain the outward flexibility that is rooted in the knowledge of what Sufism is, the knowledge which is an inward experience. As the saying has it, the Sufi teacher's duty is to have what the learner needs, no more and no less. I am also quite sure that, as the general assessment capacity among the public grows through experience, and especially by being exposed to as many real and self-deluded Sufis as possible, including charlatans, there will be the positive gain, right across the board, of identifiability of real Sufis and real teaching, certainly of its expressions through its adaptability, and a consequent shrivelling of cults and abandonment of easy answer systems. But we should remember that people will tend to get the Sufis they deserve. If there were fewer receivers of stolen goods, there would be fewer thieves. If there were no greedy people, there would be no conmen. If you want something re-wrapped, you will get a difference only in the wrapping. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.